The social justice warriors are going to keep winning until Christians figure this out. I'm Cody Leibel. I'll be interviewing Jacob Brunton today, and we're talking about how to combat the so-called social justice movement by attacking its roots, which are collectivism and anti-reason. We have to attack it in principle as Christians. We have a different perspective than a lot of the people that are anti-SJW. Quick introduction to the whole issue. There's a lot of discussion today in the church about racism and about how reparations might be needed or affirmative action might be needed. There's a lot of discussion about systematic oppression. And there's a lot of discussion about just how we as the church need to be on the front line as far as social justice. Social justice meaning a lot of different things. Can you sum up some of the things you think that is meant by that term?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that you kind of just touched on. There's definitely a racial aspect, especially in terms of categorizing people by their race or their racial background, or sometimes people want to talk about ethnicity instead of race, but it's virtually the same thing in the way that they talk about it, and an emphasis on people of a particular race that have been oppressed in the past. And that apparently a lot would claim are currently being oppressed in different ways. So there's that. There's also issues of economics and what is often referred to as economic inequality as a form of social injustice. And so the form of social justice that they would advocate for would be some form of economic equality, which usually involves some sort of progressive tax system that penalizes the rich with the idea that the rich somehow got rich by expropriating their wealth from the less fortunate, quote unquote, or the poor. But I think that the common feature is in seeing people primarily in terms of collectives, so making really wide generalizations, and instead of focusing in on or recognizing individual, whether it be individual merit or individual demerit when it comes to condemning someone for injustice, rather than focusing on actual individual actions or individual character, the emphasis is on collectives. And if you are part of a collective where that collective is seen as being an oppressor, then you deserve demerit, you deserve to be scorned. And this is where you get the concept of white privilege, and where being white is a bad thing because the idea is whites in general have oppressed non-whites, and therefore whites in general, if you're a white person, then you are somehow an oppressor of non-white people. And that's where the two forms meet, the economic aspect of focusing on inequality, and then the racial aspect of focusing on what races are typically more or less equal than others. And so it's sort of a meeting of those two emphases.
So our premise in this presentation is that the people that are combating the social justice warriors within the church or without, but the Christians that are trying to combat this are not doing the job that they could be doing. And the reason is the failure to trace back the difference of positions to the premises, the principles at the very beginning. And so there is a premise of collectivism that you just described. There's also a premise of, I don't just anti-reason in general. Like it's okay to express this is the way I think things should be, but then you don't really have to offer a way of grounding that belief. So tell me more, Jacob, about how you think that we can combat that in a unique way.
Yeah, so when you look at the social justice movement, one of the things that stands out to me, and that I think should stand out to those who oppose it, is that they don't have a whole lot of substance to their arguments, if they even present arguments, and often they don't. Often it's sort of a guilt by association type of argument, or an argument from intimidation, where it's sort of like, if you don't believe this, then you're obviously morally corrupt. And if you aren't persuaded by that, then it's sort of hollow and empty. But then if you dig a little bit deeper, they're convinced that they have good reasons. It's just that the sort of anti-SJWs aren't also convinced by those reasons. But it's important to be able to point out how their reasons are fallacious. It's important to point out that the things that they want to claim as the reasons for their positions don't actually lead to their positions. And I don't see a whole lot of that in the battle against SJWism in the church. Rather, what we see is a lot of similarly surface level knee-jerk reactions that focus on, well, this is the way that we've always done it. We socialism's scary, so it's sort of this emotional appeal to, oh, well, that's obviously evil, that's obviously scary, let's just write it off, which is true. Socialism is obviously evil, but you've got to be able to identify why it's evil, what makes it so evil. And you can't just say, I've mentioned this on social media a few times, you can't just say, well, because it's atheistic, because we've got a very theistic version of it cropping up in our circles right now. We've got a Christian version of socialism becoming very popular. And so it's not going to work to just merely say, oh, it's atheistic, or to just merely slap God into your worldview and pretend that God, therefore individual rights, without working out how theism and specifically Christianity leads to individual rights, or leads to a position and a system and a policy, and more importantly, principles that would fundamentally oppose socialism or social justice.
I think it's helpful to point out that there is a growing movement of pastors that are against the social justice trend. And they have created a document, the Statement on Social Justice, that was signed by now more than 10,000 people. And the three different things that this document mainly addressed was what is our position on race, what is our position on gender, and on sexuality. Those three things are, you could describe all of those as issues pertaining to intersectionality, or to kind of a social justice mindset, where you're looking at oppressors and oppressed. You're looking at the people that are disenfranchised. So you could be disenfranchised because of how you identify, like which gender are you, or who you're going to be married to, or you're a woman in a man's world, or you're a black person in a white person's world, for instance. So all of these issues, they were attempted to be addressed in this Statement on Social Justice. And I actually, I signed the statement because I believe that it did a significant job of addressing where the lines are. As Christians, we believe that the Bible supports that we should care about people. We should be inclusive of people in a lot of ways. And if you read that statement, almost everything that it said was really positive things about what we believe about how to handle inclusion, about how to handle oppression, or the terrible things that have happened in history. But it also drew the line, and it said, but we also don't think that you should handle these problems by doing this, this, and this, that we see the very far liberation theology type people articulating. So, Jacob, you actually have a critique of that statement because you think that perhaps, well, it drew some lines. It didn't explain why those lines need to be there. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, and I hesitate to call it a critique of the statement itself, because it's a short statement, it's concise, and therefore there's not a lot of room for it to explain the reasons behind it. But the mere fact that it doesn't offer those reasons, and that it has that ambiguity, can cause some problems, and that's really more of my concern. So it's not so much a critique as it is a concern, and the concern is we don't want to come across in opposing the social justice movement as reactionaries, or as people who want to say, let's not focus on justice in society, let's just focus on the gospel, right? Because if we say that, if we say, all right, the reason we oppose social justice is not because we think they're getting justice wrong, but because we just want to focus on the gospel, well, guess what? Next week or next month, when you go and oppose abortion, they're going to come to you and they're going to say, hey, aren't you opposing injustice in society? Aren't you supposed to just be focusing on the gospel? And this has been one of Russell Moore's major critiques. And I think we need to arm ourselves against that by being able to say, no, we actually do care about justice in society. We do believe that the gospel has very important moral implications for public policy and for social interaction. We just think that the social justice warriors are getting them diametrically wrong. And that's the problem. But if we don't say that, if we don't offer the alternative view of justice, then really what we're doing is we're just sort of retreating into an inconsistent position where we're saying, well, we care about justice when it is something that affects the unborn, but we don't care about justice when it's something that supposedly affects this minority group or this group of people. And it looks very inconsistent. And then the alternative is nothing. We haven't offered an alternative view of justice. And so the more consistent position that is trying to worry about justice across the board, and that is actually taking interest in applying the gospel to social interactions, they're going to win out in the end if we are only offering an inconsistent alternative.
Okay, that's helpful, especially comparing the issue of abortion to the issues that others are bringing up, such as, I don't know, like the plight of if you were a Black mother. And, you know, I've heard people say, well, since you don't seem to show any evidence that you care about how hospitals treat Black mothers, therefore you don't get to talk about abortion. I'm like, there's a name for that argument. But anyway, so let's talk about some of the passages that are usually brought up by someone like Russell Moore or Matt Chandler, that they're in the Bible and they're important, they're true, we affirm them, and we need to just show what they're saying about those verses versus what we think the Bible actually is saying with those. So, you know, an important one would be James. We'll look at some New Testament and some Old, but James 1:27, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. And later on in the book, it condemns the rich who are hoarding their wealth, and it also condemns partiality. Partiality cuts both ways, but favoring the rich in the church context. We could look at Amos. Matt Chandler, and maybe it was not Matt Chandler, maybe it was David Platt preached just this summer at a big like T4G or something on Amos. Do you remember what the chapter was, Jacob?
I don't recall, no.
But it was, like, let justice flow like waters, that passage. It might be Amos 3 or something like that. But these are passages that talk about how we must love justice, and we should be seeking it. Let's see if I can find it right here. Anyway, Jacob, do you have it open in front of you? I
don't. No, I'm sorry. I'm trying to manage 3 things at once. Sorry.
Gotcha. Another one that, in Amos, he talks about the people that are gluttons. He calls the women cows of Bashan who live on Mount Samaria, and they say to their husbands, bring us drinks. And then he says, but that's, you're going to be attacked by another nation. You're going to be dragged away by fish hooks, through your noses. And he says, you just don't care about the poor people. And so, I mean, there's a lot of, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's a lot about how you have to care about justice.
So it's Amos 5:24, but Amos 5:24, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
Yes. And I mean, and it's more than that. I mean, it's all through the book of Amos and a lot of the other prophets. Like in verse 11, 5:11 or 5:10, there are those who hate the one who upholds justice in court and detest the one who tells the truth. You levy straw tax on the poor and you impose a tax on their grain. And then, so these people were getting rich off of taxing the poor, and they take bribes. They deprive the poor of justice in the courts. And God is saying that's not right. You have to hate evil. You have to love good. You have to maintain justice in the courts. And I mean, you compare, there's this passage in Isaiah where Isaiah 5:20, woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. These people that God is talking about here were calling good evil and evil good and getting away with it. We have to agree with those who have preached from these passages. That's not all right. but then we have to be willing to look more carefully about our assumptions about what is justice, because if, we could just be in the same position as them unless we think through what is it saying about what is just.
Yeah. So as you pointed out, the contemporary social justice crowd are going to appeal to these passages to argue for their view of justice in society. And if we say, let's not focus on that, let's just focus on the gospel, then we're saying we don't care about those passages, in effect. What we need to do is we need to say, no, we absolutely agree with those passages. Verily and amen, brother, you're reading it wrong. And we need to feel the weight of Isaiah 5:20 coming down on our shoulders, where it says, like Cody just read, woe to you who call evil good and good evil. Right? So the social justice warriors are reading this passage and they're saying, this is evil and this is good. This is unjust and this is just. And we're saying, as those who oppose the social justice warriors, no, you've got it exactly wrong. What you call justice is actually injustice. And what you call injustice is actually justice. And one side's right and the other side's wrong here. And there is no middle ground. And I think that's the thing that we who are opposing the social justice warriors need to really be convinced of deep down in our souls and have that conviction. There is no middle ground here. One of us has the woe of Isaiah 5:20 on our heads. And it's really important that we figure it out. And that's where we kind of transition into why we think that what we're emphasizing for the New Christian Intellectual is extremely important for the movement against social justice. And that is that we need to be able to discern between true justice and false justice. We need to be able to discern between what is actually good and what is actually evil, as opposed to just what the majority of people today are calling good or evil, or what the majority of Christian thought leaders are calling good or evil. And then the question is, well, all right, well, how do you discern that? You can't discern it by taking a poll of contemporary Christians. You can't discern it by taking a poll of historical Christians. You can't discern it by merely reading the passages, because they're reading those passages too. You can't discern it by knee-jerk reactions about what seems right without any sort of argument or rationale behind it. The only way to really objectively and actually discern between what is really good and evil, what is really just and unjust, is to use your own independent judgment to think hard about God's word and about God's reality to figure out what really is just. It's up to each individual person. You've got the moral responsibility. You're going to stand alone before the throne of judgment for what you advocated as being good or evil, just or unjust. And you won't be able to rely on the excuse that, well, my pastor said so, or Russell Moore said so, or Tim Keller said so.
There was a comment about what exactly is a widow, because I brought it up from James 1. First Timothy talks about that. And there's somebody whose husband has passed away, but then there's widows indeed that he describes. And that is somebody who is a member of the church and who is living according to the standards of the church, and somebody who does not have others that can step in and provide. There's lots of descriptions like that. If you want to dig deep into what is justice in the Bible, it's about the courts. It's about those who are governing, giving rulings between those who have rival claims and saying, here's who owns this property. And there is no redistribution of wealth according to some kind of socialist scheme. In fact, when somebody tried to redistribute wealth to Jesus, he said, it's not my business. Because the guy said, come and divide my inheritance between me and my brother. Jesus is like, this isn't even my business. It's not my problem. So that you don't see in the Bible this idea that you have to equalize wealth, or that inequality is an injustice by definition. I would question that as a premise, because most people seem to think, inequality, that in itself is evidence of there being a cosmic injustice. It's just not so. And what matters as far as justice that I see through the Old Testament prophets, through the Torah, it's equal treatment under the law. So, not bribing the judges, not showing partiality to the rich or toward the poor. And you can see that through Scripture. There's specific passages that say that. It's everybody has their individual rights, and you uphold their individual rights. I found it really interesting that in the Old Testament there actually talks about the rights of people in a way that was like, wow, that's historically the conception of rights that we have today grew gradually, especially it was reinforced by the ancient Romans, but they even had it before the Romans, long before the Romans. So, Jacob, I think that we should talk about the passage where Jesus says what his mission is. That comes up so much when you're talking to those who are kind of apologizing for socialism or making way for socialism. So it's in Luke 4 when Jesus begins his ministry after his time in the desert. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me," and he's in a synagogue and he's reading from Isaiah. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And so people will say, oh, okay, Jesus' ministry involves especially proclaiming good news to the poor, especially freedom for the prisoners, especially helping the sick, or the blind in this case, especially helping the oppressed. So what is he talking about in this passage?
Whenever people would demand miracles from him, he would say, in effect, that's not why I'm here. The miracles were to point to the message, and the message was about healing spiritual poverty, setting free the captives of sin, those who were in bondage to sin and under the wrath of God. That was Jesus's mission, that what he came to do. The things that he did to help the physically blind and the materially poor were to point to that. And for us, you can say that they are to be expressions of that, expressions of the gospel. But the point is the gospel. And if at any point our picturing out that gospel contradicts the gospel, then you can know that we've gotten something wrong.
So let's talk about how we can combat the social justice warriors in a way that is distinct. And specifically, instead of saying, oh, we just don't believe in that socialist idea, you trace it down to the collectivist premise, the premise that injustices are done not to individual people, but they're done to entire groups. And therefore, if in the past some group has been hurt or treated differently, then the solution is now to tax everybody and redistribute so that it's all egalitarian in the outcome. That's a collectivist premise. You cannot combat collectivism by simply saying collectivism is wrong. You have to say why it's wrong. And one of the best ways to say why it's wrong is to say, what is the alternative principle? Can you talk about the alternative?
Yeah, so the alternative to collectivism is individualism. And most Christians are going to run with their hair on fire away from that term because we've so heartily demonized it in our culture. But there's no reason to demonize it. Individualism doesn't mean you go off on your own, don't listen to anybody else, and it's you against the world, no matter what, and thumbing your nose at everybody else. Individualism means you're willing to do that. You're willing to be you against the world if need be, but it doesn't always need to be that way, right? Individualism means even if the entire world or the entire church says that I must bow the knee to the Pope, I'm going to say no, unless I'm convinced by scripture or reason that I'm wrong. I'm bound to my conscience. I can do no other. And I'm paraphrasing Martin Luther there. Martin Luther was exhibiting individualism in his stand against Rome. And everyone who wanted to criticize him for following his own judgment, his own independent judgment, as opposed to the collective judgment of the church, all of those people who opposed him for that reason would have been the collectivists of the time. And that's just one historical example. We can talk about lots of other historical examples or contemporary examples. But the issue is what is the fundamental unit in society? And a little bit more importantly, what is your responsibility before God? Do you as an individual have a responsibility before God, regardless of what anybody else says or thinks? And it might be the case, in fact, it often is the case, that you have a responsibility before God to listen to other people and to take in their advice and to discern between good advice and bad advice. But the point is that at the end of the day, it's your own judgment. You are going to be held responsible individually for who you listen to and who you don't listen to, for the advice that you take in and act on and the advice that you reject and don't act on. Each one of us is going to stand individually before the throne of judgment, and each one of us individually is responsible for the things that we do and the truths that we teach or the lies that we teach about God and about his word and about his world. And that is what individualism is. And the alternative is a form of collectivism where you abdicate individual responsibility, or you replace or substitute individual responsibility for some sort of collective responsibility, whether it's the collective of your church or the collective of the church worldwide, or the collective of your race, or the collective of your family, or the collective of your culture. Whatever the case may be, you're substituting the individual for some collective. And that's where you end up running into a lot of problems.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up the Facebook Live component of this and bring on about 12 or so of our patrons and friends are joined on right now on a video conference, and we're going to have a discussion. First of all, I'm going to ask for points of clarification for anything that was said, and then we'll go toward if you want to contribute and go deeper and add your own input. So points of clarification.
Obviously, the Bible does tell us, okay, give to the poor, give to the needy. So it seems like what Jesus taught about that might be a little bit different from what Rand taught about it. So what would you say to that? What would you say to the fact that, we are commanded to give to the poor, and how might we respond to somebody who points that out in favor of social justice and socialism, things like that? If that's not the whole video we just did.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. The first thing, the most important thing, and some people might think that this is pedantic, but it's gravely important. The most important thing is to identify that, yes, Jesus commands us to give to the poor, but why? Not as an act of justice, but as an act of charity. Meaning, in a way that demonstrates they do not deserve it. And the reason why is because it's supposed to be a picture of the gospel. It's supposed to be a picture of what he has done for us on the cross. And if we help the recipient of charity pretend that it's not charity, if we help them pretend that it's somehow a form of justice where they deserve it or where we owe it to them, then we are lying about the gospel. Because then we're in effect saying, you likewise deserved what Christ did for you on the cross, or Jesus likewise owed that to you. So that is the most important distinction to make between what we would affirm in affirming those passages and what the social justice warriors would affirm in affirming those passages. We want to say, yes, those passages absolutely command us to give to the poor, but they command us to do it as an act of charity in order to picture forth the gospel, which means that they don't deserve it. We're obligated to do it, but not because they deserve it, not because we owe it to them, but because we want to out of the goodness of our heart. And then the question is, all right, now, why do you want to, or why should you want to? And I don't think that it's apparent that you should want to in every situation. And I don't think it's apparent that the Bible would command you to in every situation. In fact, I think there's a really good example of Jesus denying the idea that you need to give to charity in every situation. And that's when Mary comes and pours the expensive perfume on his feet as an act of worship. And Judas says, that was so expensive. We could have fed so many poor people with that. And Jesus says, he rebukes him and says, the poor you will always have with you. Me, you won't always have with you. In other words, what Jesus was saying was, her using that wealth to worship me was more important than her using that wealth to feed poor people. Which should tell us that it's possible for our wealth to be better used to glorify God in certain circumstances than in giving it to the poor. Or another way to put it is giving to the poor isn't automatically the best or the only way to glorify God with our wealth. Sometimes there's going to be other ways that we ought to glorify God with our wealth that preclude us from giving to the poor. And then when you get into, all right, well, how do you figure it out? Well, then you've got to really study it. There's a lot of issues, and you can get in the weeds there. And I would love to work out sort of a theology or a philosophy of that sometime in book format. But I think that's the direction you need to go, is recognize, first of all, it's not an act of justice, it's an act of charity. And then second of all, it's not always the best way to glorify God. Often there are better ways to glorify God with your wealth. And then it's a matter of trying to figure out, all right, what is the best way in a given circumstance to glorify God with your wealth? And if it happens to be that it's to give to someone in need, then awesome, amen, do it, and do it as a picture of the gospel. Does that make sense? Cool.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a category error between justice and mercy. It's the conflation between the two. And I think that's where the biggest problem within this whole discussion lies, is conflating justice with mercy.
Yeah, I agree. That's the most important point here. It's got a lot of tangential applications that are also important, but that's the most important part. Yeah. Were there any other clarifying questions before we move on to more dynamic interaction?
Just to dovetail off of what Jacob said about how our charity is supposed to be a kind of a demonstration of the gospel. I think it's rather interesting that this social justice climate that we see ourselves in right now is at the same time where we see a lot of universal salvation messages out there. Because if you have an understanding that the gospel itself is something that I can be presumptive about because God just grants it to everybody, therefore I can be presumptive about charity and say, well, hey, I deserve this because doesn't everybody get this too? I think there's kind of a relationship there that, maybe needs to be explored a bit more.
Yeah, and if you haven't already, I've written a couple articles on that very topic. They're all on christianintellectual.com. One of them is the theological problem with Tim Keller's so-called social justice. Mm-hmm. Another one is true justice, who owns what and to whom is what owed. And then another one, a little less on that topic, was my reply to Joe Carter on social justice. But they all touch on that in various ways. And I think that's a really important point. So if you haven't read those articles, go ahead and read those and share them if you find them helpful. Any other clarifying questions? Go ahead, Greg.
Is there a time when group justice might be appropriate? For example, my understanding is that Germany to this day does a lot to support Israel. The Holocaust is obviously a quite terrible thing, but most of the people who are alive at that time are dead now. So at what point, if ever, is there group guilt? Because I mean, even in Scripture, see, I'm playing devil's advocate somewhat, but even in Scripture, there's times where God will judge a nation, or He'll pour out judgment on the descendants of somebody who sinned. So, are there exceptions to our rule of individualism that just because a white person did? I'll let you go ahead. I think you get the idea.
Yeah. So I don't think that there are exceptions, but I can see why it seems like there's at least an apparent exception in those examples that you pointed out. And I think the way to think about it is, are the descendants or the individuals who are sort of being punished for the parent sins or whatever the case is, are they either complicit in the injustice, meaning that they could have stopped it but didn't, or they should have stopped it but didn't, or they could have acted against it or should have acted against it in a way that they failed to? So in that sense, they're complicit, or are they persisting and insisting in the same injustice? So maybe their parents started it, but the children have continued it, then I think it's appropriate to sort of do what appears to be a collective judgment, but really it's just it's individual judgment against everyone, and everyone is just sort of complicit in it. Now there's also the aspect of, you know, if we're talking about God judging nations, well, when God judges any individual, every individual who's a sinner, which is everyone, deserves eternal hell. So it's kind of hard to say, well, that person didn't really deserve that punishment. Well, no, God owed them eternal wrath. And the fact that he killed them early, even though they were innocent of this sort of collective sin that was going around, maybe this one individual was innocent of it, but the rest of his culture was guilty of it, and God happened to kill him along with them. I think that that's not so much him being punished for their evil. I think it's more him probably being punished for his own evil, or maybe even God granting him mercy by killing him rather than him having to live on in the midst of that evil, you know, and bringing him to glory if he was saved, right? So there's all kinds of ways to kind of think about it in different contexts, in different wider and more specific contexts. But I don't think it's an exception to the individualism that we were talking about. Does that make sense? Cool.
Let's try to get around to as many people as possible. So more questions or
Yeah, they don't have to be
comments.
clarifying. We can kind of open it up to general questions and comments.
Yeah, see, CJ, let me unmute you. There you go.
Yeah. Quick questions side by side. One is perhaps an observation. When we talk about the social justice movement, I'm not actually concerned about, say, for example, affirmative action. I don't think that's going to go anywhere in terms of, you know, momentum. A movement that I see, which I think is more concerning to me, which I think is potentially more destructive, are movements like the Me Too movement. And also, because, for example, the tendency to mandate that someone is guilty until proven innocent. We saw that through the Kavanaugh situation for Justice Kavanaugh.
Mm-hmm.
That was very concerning to me. And then not only that, it's this whole idea of get this person that's been alleged to be guilty to be punished unlimited, you know, as much as possible. Like you hear about a CEO who is alleged to have harassed someone. He hasn't been found guilty. Then the fact that he's about to be given, he loses his job, which is what a kind of a punishment by, you know, the tyranny of the majority. And then the $100 million handshake for losing the job is also actually, you know, addressed by the group. He should lose that too. He hasn't been found guilty, but it's just as if let's you know, destroy him as much as possible emotionally and financially,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of a verdict. That's very concerning to me. And I see the same thing happening outside the Me Too movement with what a movement called emotional labor. It's this whole debate about the stay-at-home woman doing most of the chores. And what I see, what's concerning with me about that debate, is almost as if the contribution that the working man makes in terms of his, you know, the upkeep of the home and the food and clothing, et cetera, is set to zero. I see the man being, you know, emasculated, and then the baseline for judging his contribution to the home is assessed purely on how many chores he does, regardless of the fact that he's playing a significant role. And that's a woman that's actually wrote a book called Emotional Labor, which actually addresses this whole thing about how women, for example, are being abused and are being oppressed because
Mm-hmm.
they do most of the chores at home, independently of the role that a man plays as a provider. To address the issue about exceptions, I think there's an exception if the guilty party that was the party that was guilty of oppression is an institution. So let's say, for example, a government was guilty of, say, endorsing or participating in, say, the slave trade. Okay, I don't think a statute of limitation should apply because that institution is still alive today as opposed to an individual. We're not talking about descendants. So when we're talking about institution, if we can trace affected parties, descendants of these actual slaves, then in that sense, the question of what's I've even forgotten the word, of repayment can be addressed. But I don't think it's as nuanced as that saying, well, we were oppressed, therefore pay us. Now, let's address the situation with African Americans. Yes, slaves were brought over here, they were descendants. But the reality is, in Africa, the average African is poorer than the average African American today. And African Americans, since the abolition of slavery, have received a lot of benefits from the United States. So to me, it becomes a situation of math. Yes, there may be liabilities, but you've also amassed significant benefits by being a US citizen, by getting food stamps, whatever it is. Let's do the math and then see what's left. And you might actually find out that when you subtract the benefits from the liabilities, they might actually end up owing the United States.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. Let me touch on the first part where you said that you weren't as concerned about affirmative action as you are about Me Too.
Well, not affirmative action. I was talking about the idea of repatriation. Well, what was the term? I forgot.
Racial reparations.
That's about reparations. That's what I mean.
Or racial justice, it's sometimes called. Let me just point out, they have a common principle or a common theme that we should be concerned about. And that is, if you want to go really broad, just injustice in general. You talked about with the Me Too movement being innocent or being guilty until proven innocent, and having these arbitrary accusations ruin your life. Well, that's happened to a lot of people with the arbitrary accusation of racism, and you see the arbitrary accusation of racism used as a sort of bludgeon to silence people and make people cower into certain positions that they wouldn't otherwise hold, or to accept certain unearned guilt. And so there are a lot of underlying principles that are shared between those two issues. So I would say just be careful. Don't focus so much on the immediate consequences of the concrete being advocated. Focus more on what's the underlying assumption and what are the logical conclusions if you take that assumption seriously. And I think if you look at the logical underlying assumption, it's the same with the Me Too movement and the racial reparations movement and all those other things, or at least that they're very, very similar or intertwined, such that they have very similar logical outworking. So be careful about that.
Very good point. Thank you.
With the emotional neighbor thing, I don't know much about that, so I'm just not going to touch on that. I'm just going to kind of set that aside. Maybe you can send me some resources on that, and we can kind of talk about that next time, maybe. And then with you were talking about the exceptions and the institutions. So I realized I didn't answer the first part of the last question. I absolutely do not think that Germany should still be helping Israel. I think it's totally appropriate for the institution that oppressed a people to make reparations to the actual people that were oppressed. Once you get into later generations, especially multiple later generations, it becomes nearly impossible to ferret out whether or not someone actually was negatively affected by their grandparents' oppression. And then also the institution, maybe the institution is still around, but those funding the institution and those running the institution aren't the same people. And so if you have the government, if the government is paying reparations, let's say, the government doesn't have any money other than what it extorts from the citizens. And the citizens aren't the same ones who voted for slavery back then, or whatever the case may be. And so it would be unjust, it would be an injustice to extract or redistribute wealth from innocent people to alleviate the quote unquote suffering of people who never actually suffered. You're punishing the non-oppressors and rewarding the non-oppressed. There's no justice there at all. I don't think.
Well, I think it's different when you talk about an institution which is a legal entity. If you're dealing with a corporation, which is a legal entity in its own right, and historically it committed a crime, you could say say the same thing. Well, today that their source of income, some different customers buying their products, therefore they should not pay. But it's a legal entity. So I don't know.
Yes, it is a legal entity, but there's still going to be a statute of limitations. Because it's not the customers that you'd be concerned about the injustice; it's the shareholders. And if it's a completely new generation of shareholders, and if it's past the statute of limitations, I don't know what the statute of limitations is on corporation crimes, but there's probably one, right? And it makes sense that there would be one, because if it's been a couple decades, it doesn't make any sense for the contemporary shareholders to quote unquote pay for the injustices committed by shareholders that they had nothing to do with and decisions that they had nothing to do with. So that, and I think that's why we have the whole concept of statute of limitations, is because it becomes arbitrary, that there's no way to objectively figure out what or who is actually responsible for the suffering, and what or who actually suffered. So, well, let's go ahead and move on. I think it's a good topic, and
Sure.
for that more. So,
Thank you.
Can we go over to Anthony's question?
yeah.
Hey, Jacob. So Cody and I were discussing this a little bit earlier in the day. Previously, I always viewed capitalism as being synonymous with cronyism, but I know that that's a bad view of it. Now, when the left and the social justice movement raises issues with crony corporatism, and that's a legitimate concern, I know that crony corporatism is not as big of a threat as the social justice movement necessarily, but it seems like it gives the left some legitimate ammo against like laissez-faire thinkers and non-social justice thinkers. So, like, do you think that should be a major point in addressing, to kind of take that leverage away from them, because it does give them some legitimate leverage? Or do you think that's more of a minor point that maybe can be addressed but doesn't necessarily need to be a focal point?
So I don't want to speak too much about the emphasis that we should place on it, because I think it's a symptom of an underlying problem, and the underlying problem, I think, is what you're putting your finger on. And there are a number of similar symptoms. And what the underlying problem is just inconsistency on the conservative side, or the quote unquote conservative side. It's unprincipled inconsistency that gives rise to something like cronyism among corporations, but also lots of other things. You know, that there's cronyism among the the military industrial complex. There's conservatives who want to end welfare for immigrants, but they don't want to end welfare for steel workers, or where the case may be. So that they might be for certain types of welfare, but not other types of welfare. Or for certain types of government handouts, or certain types of redistribution, but not other types of redistribution, or certain types of government intervention in the economy, but not other types of government intervention in the economy. And all of that, I think, are similar symptoms to what you just pointed out, of the inconsistency that conservatives have, where they are adopting the fundamental premise of the left, of the progressives, where they say, yes, the government should intervene for the common good. I just disagree on what the common good is. And in that sense, it really does take the wind out of the sails of the conservative argument, because then you're not being consistent. Then when you appeal to individual rights, or you talk a big game about limited government, or about not wanting government intervention in the economy, or not wanting redistribution of wealth, the progressive socialists can just laugh in your face and say, you don't mean that. And they're right, you don't. If you're not taking a principled, consistent stand. And so I think what you're pointing your finger on is really the issue of consistency and principle that we really need to recover, and that will include being loud and aggressive on things like cronyism, but also on all those other things that are brought up, and all the other things that we could bring up. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Well, let's go over to Clay next, and then Darren.
Cool. Clay, you're muted. I don't know if you... Okay, you just unmuted yourself.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. I tend to agree with what you're saying, and I think the biggest problem that I see is where do we draw the line? Because who in this country is 100% white? I mean, even Elizabeth Warren had a little piece of Native American in her. Me, myself, my grandfather owned. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So who's paying reparations is essentially what I'm getting to. But my grandfather on my mother's side is 50% Cherokee Indian. So would I get 1/8 of whatever reparations are being paid? And how do they think this is all going to divvy out in the end? Who is going to be paying this? Who are these 100% pure white people who had everything to do with slavery? how do we pinpoint these people? What do we do with people that are, you know, mulatto, half white, half black? How do you think they see this going forward? I see some of them saying, well, you just need to acknowledge that you owe something. Okay, well, let's just say we acknowledge that. Where does it go from there? How does this play out? What happens to the SBC? And I know I'm rapid firing questions, but I'd just love to hear your response.
No, I think those are all sort of the same general question, which is basically, or observation, I think, which is basically that it's all arbitrary and subjective. They can't identify an objective standard or an objective criteria for figuring out what would constitute justice on any given issue. And I think that's important to point out, that they can't do that. Now, if we're going to point that out, we need to be prepared to offer an objective alternative. Otherwise, we're going to be inconsistent. So yes, we need to point out they aren't able to offer an objective criteria. And this goes back to what we were just talking about with, you know, the issue of statute of limitations. That's part of the reason why we have a statute of limitations, is because in order to objectively apply the law or objectively apply justice in a situation, you've got to be able to figure out who objectively is responsible and who objectively was wrong and to what degree and in what way. And, you know, there's a lot of details that are really, really important in figuring that out. And if you don't do that, then what you have is just this arbitrary, subjective, range of the moment thing where anything goes, potentially. You could end up punishing every single person who has any white skin, or you could end up punishing just those who have, you know, 75% or more white in them. It's completely arbitrary. There's no way to pinpoint it. And it's really just a matter of how consistent or how passionate the other side wants to be. And that's a really dangerous position, which I think obviously nobody wants to be in. And so once you point that out, you know, people are going to kind of put on the brakes and realize, oh, that's a problem. And then the issue is, like I said, you've got to be able to identify, all right, here's an alternative objective standard for how we can really take justice seriously, because we want to take justice seriously. We really want to punish oppressors and help the oppressed, but we need to be objective about it rather than being arbitrary and subjective about it. I think Cody said Darren was going to be next.
You know, Clay, was there anything else you wanted to add before we move on?
No, I mean, I think that pretty much sums it up. I can, you know, it's appealing to, you know, somebody's own circumstance, but I have a buddy who is first generation Polish, who has no, you know, he's as white as they come, married an African. And I guess what I'm getting to is, you could probably find an easier pinpoint back to her ancestors selling black people into slavery through the slave trade than you could him owing reparations, being, you know, as white gets. And I think it's just it's a rabbit hole that people are going down, and there's no way to trace any of it. And I do get what you're saying. You know, you need to be able to answer the question and not just throw more questions at it. But the whole thing seems so silly to me at this point, that Christians are actually arguing this like grace. You know, we just set grace completely aside, and what was done on the cross, we just set that aside, and then we start going after brothers. You know, those that we would call brothers, especially referring to the SBC. This kind of thing, it makes me sick that this is even something that we're having to discuss between what we would consider brothers in the Lord, that we are even having to discuss reparations. I mean, it's sickening to me. And it only shows me that, man, we're in a lot of trouble. Those of us that are in the SBC, and I am no longer in the SBC, but grew up in the SBC, I see nothing but trouble. And I'm not the prophet or son of a prophet, as Paul Washington would say. But it does not look good right now.
Yeah, so I think that brings up another important point, well, a related point at least. I would say, so if I actually oppressed a black person, let's say, but you know, let's say I enslaved a black person, and you know, extracted X amount of wealth from them over a period of time, and then later on I repented of that. And I said, you know, I'm sorry, brother. You know, we're Christians now. I'm sorry. It's true that they shouldn't demand that I give them reparations before they forgive me. That's the gospel, and I think you're right about that. But I think it's also true that I absolutely should give them reparations. That would also be my obligation as a follower of Christ to do what's possible to make my wrongs right insofar as I can. But that's not what's going on here. And this gets to the original point that you brought up. It's not the case that I actually enslaved a black person. And it's not the case that I actually owe them anything. It's not the case that I actually wronged them in any way. And the idea that I did and that I somehow therefore owe them something is what's driving the whole social justice movement, particularly the racial justice movement. And what you were pointing out is that there's no way, if we're going to operate off that premise that just because someone of a similar skin color did something to someone else with a similar skin color, therefore you're guilty of that. If we're going to operate off of that, there's no way to draw the line. It's totally arbitrary. It's totally anything goes. And that's what is sort of a demonstration of the fact that it's nonsense. It's not something that we should take seriously. It's not something that Christians should be taking seriously. So those are sort of two separate issues. It's one is, did it actually happen? And if it did, then I probably should give the reparations, even though they shouldn't demand it of me because of the gospel. But then the other issue is, it didn't happen. And this idea that somehow because of our collective skin colors, we can pretend that it happened is so bogus and so arbitrary and so subjective that we shouldn't have been taking it seriously.
Agreed. I really weep over the SBC right now. I mean, I think I love Albert Mohler, but man, I have some serious struggles right now with some of the things that he's done. And I think we as a group of Christians, we need to be praying for the SBC because
absolutely.
If it falls, it's going to be a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, well, let's go to Darren next, and then Greg, and anyone else, let me know, and I'll make sure to point the attention on you.
All right. Thanks, Cody. So I just wanted to talk to what Jacob was saying. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. When Jacob, you were talking about the need to listen to people when they bring things up to you about issues. And several years ago when Black Lives Matter got started, the social justice movement kind of swept through my Christian circle. And people were saying that if I don't support Black Lives Matter, then I must hate black people and want them to be shot on the street. And I was saying, well, to God, all lives matter. And, the contrast of many of my Christian friends coming at me and saying that I need to support this. And it was really confusing. And so I reached out to some leaders who were, progressive Christians. And I'm like, how do I understand the social justice movement? And they told me that I had to go out and read James Baldwin and Coates' books, and that would explain social justice to me. So I go out and I read it, and it certainly opened my eyes. And what I realized was, I needed to listen to other people, but then I needed to discern what the truth is. And people are telling me what my heart is and judging me when they don't even know what my heart is. And they're proclaiming a virtue. And the thing I like about the Christian intellectual is there's the presumption that if you don't support this movement, then you are against the movement. And the presumption, presupposing that this movement is right just because of a statement. But to actually understand, well, why do I believe that they're right or wrong is what you guys keep driving any topic to, is why do you think that? What's the epistemology of your beliefs?
Yeah.
And as I read these books and I'm praying and seeking God on the truth, and I lay out my heart, during worship and say, God, if there's any, bigotry or bias towards people, get it out of me. And I realized in God leading me to a different book by Stuart Greaves, and I'll just read this quote, and it really sets the stage. It says, when our works of justice are fueled by human sentiment and political agenda, this can lead to impatience and frustration. But if our vision for justice is fueled by God's plan for justice and our interaction with him through Christ, Jesus will impart his resolve, his wisdom, and divine gentleness to our spirit. And the way I look at social justice is, where is God calling me to bring justice to situations? And, everybody's making a claim on our lives. Somebody's claiming that I need to be supporting Black Lives Matter. Someone's claiming that I need to be supporting Women's March. Somebody's claiming that I need to support LGBT rights. Like, where am I supposed to spend my time? I'm like, and when you get down to the brass tacks, it's what is God calling me to do? Where are we individually, not collectively, but individually, where are we supposed to be spending our energy? God has planned out our lives. God has a perfect plan for us, and in the obedience, we will find that virtue. Collectivism says that we'll find virtue through man's laws, that you can pass a reparation law and everything will be right. It does nothing to address the heart. Listening to other people and making these claims, albeit I think they were wrong, but it led me in humility to seek God and the truth on what I can do to be an arm of God's justice. Now, justice is God's. Justice is the Lord's, and there's a lot of injustice in the world. But my responsibility is to be obedient to, help feed my starving children is a thing in Minnesota. And I support that because God's led me to do that. If God tells you to feed a family for a year, then do it. But if someone comes bang on your door and says you need to support, this particular cause, and God's not telling you to do it, your resources, I'm using my resources, and the example of laying out the perfume at Jesus' feet was awesome. And I'm so going to use that because we're called to use our resources to glorify God and be obedient. She was obedient in that. There were probably other people that brought their wealth into the church to minister to the poor and the hungry. And, and to that's what the bookkeeper keeps track of. But to us, virtue comes from obedience to Christ, not through collectivism and passing laws and trying to find virtue outside of Christ. Your standing with Christ has to come first.
Yeah, our calling for our wealth and for everything else is ultimately and primarily glorify God. And then the question is, what's the best way to do that in the given circumstances that he's placed me in? And you've got to be really wise and discerning in what he's calling you to do based on those circumstances and based on your calling. In addition to that, though, I want to say you also have to be discerning about whether or not what someone is claiming God might be calling you to do is a lie or is involved in a lie, right? So there are a lot of people who believe that they're being called by God to support Black Lives Matter. And I want to say they're deceived. God is not calling them to support that because it's an evil organization founded on a lie. And God doesn't call you to support lies, right? So in addition to being a wise steward of your own time and not giving into the bullying of these different pressure groups, which I think is wise, you also need to be able to be wise in the sense of discerning, hey, even though you're advocating this in the name of Christ or in the name of the glory of God or whatever the case may be, the name of justice or the name of a good cause, that's not true. It's based on a lie. And I'm absolutely not going to support that, and neither should you, brother. So good. I think Greg was next.
Yeah. It just seems like it's an interesting thing because, like, I can talk about Darren's sentiments where I had the exact same story happen to me as you and Cody are well aware. And actually, that's how you guys tracked me down because I was so vocally opposed to it. Especially when, the founders of Black Lives Matter, like the three women who founded it, were openly saying they support Assata Shakur, who was a convicted cop killer. She killed cops, didn't matter if they were black or white. In the words of her organization, a pig was a pig. And I made a whole video documenting that. But there's something that really bothers me about the social justice movement because there is something where you could see why somebody might think certain things, why somebody might think, oh, well, white people in America owe black people for slavery. And you could see where somebody might come from with that. You could see why somebody might think that. However, it's so inconsistent and it's so pointed and targeted, where it's like, okay, if you're a straight white male, then you're evil. If you're a Christian, then you're super evil. So there's a lot that's really pointing where there's clearly an underlying agenda. I can't, I always assume, I've always generally assumed that people generally think like me. They generally think rationally, but they might have bad information. But this is absurd. My ancestors, if you don't mind me, I'll go on a brief tangent. My dad told me a story where it was like 11 or 12 brothers, all who went to go fight in the Civil War, to end slavery. And only 2 of them came back. And my dad, pointed out kind of in jest, he goes, where's our reparations? Yet because of the color of my skin, I'm lumped in together with people who actually owned slaves. And a lot of my ancestors were from half a continent away. And, not to go too much on a tangent, but I wrote a short story where it takes place on Mars. It's in the future, colonized by people from Africa. But then a lot of the slaves are Russian, and they talk about the evils of the Eurasian. So everybody from Great Britain over to Japan is all lumped together in one group. But what's the logic? How is that logically any different than what these guys are wanting? So, I mean, it's just there's so many ways you can slice up that pie. You can blame all Asians for the attack on Pearl Harbor, just as logically as you can blame all white people for slavery, which is, with zero actual logic. And so
and the fact that they don't do that, the fact that they're inconsistent tells you that they don't actually believe in the principle that they're operating off of, right? That they don't actually believe that you're guilty based on the color of your skin in association with people who did bad things with the same color of skin.
What's the end goal?
What they're actually wanting to do is silence a certain type of people, a certain type of political opposition, and in their minds, the majority of white people in America are for sort of conservative Western values, and the majority of non-white people are against. And so it demonstrates that really what they're after is the destruction of Western civilization. I think that's really the ultimate motivation. You have to tease that out and kind of do a little bit more studying and digging to prove that out. But I think that's probably what you would find, because they aren't consistent. They don't want to consistently target everyone who has a skin color associated with people who did evil things in the past. They only want to target those who have skin color associated with people who did evil things in the past, who are supporting sort of traditional Western values. And you'll notice if you're a white person who joins them in attacking traditional Western values, then you're viewed as one of them, and you're sort of forgiven for your white privilege or whatever the case may be. So
let's move ahead to Jordan.
Hey, so I wanted to make a comment on where primary identity comes from as humans. And this comes down to like the collectivist versus individualist argument. I think it's at the core of it. So where does our primary identity come from as humans? If it comes from the group, where whatever the group's will is what our identity is, then that means that the group's will necessarily both determines reality and morality for each one of us. And that's very clearly a subjective morality. There's no objective moral principles now. It's just whatever the group's will is. I think that there's a large faction of the SJWs who have not really realized that yet. And when they do realize it, it'll be a little bit of an Overton window shifting shock for them. But there are quite a few that are very aware that the collectivist morality equals morality is completely subjective based on whatever the group currently assumes. The other thing I was going to say was that forgiveness requires works, such as being a white person and then saying, okay, I'm with you guys now, then there is no forgiveness that doesn't require works. And then God's forgiveness for us, which didn't require any works from us, is some kind of pseudo false forgiveness that doesn't really exist. In the SJW mind, forgiveness can only be accompanied by some kind of work on someone's behalf to excuse themselves of their own privilege.
Yeah, so remind me to come back to the issue of works in a second, because I want to touch on that, but I also want to touch on what the first thing you said about collectivism versus individualism. I think you're touching on a good point, and that relates to the contemporary idea that a lot of Christians have bought into, especially Christians in seminary, and especially Christians who have studied anything about missions, or who are involved in missions. And that is the idea of, what is it? Multiculturalism. Yes, there we go.
Collective conscience as well.
Yeah. So what I was going to point out is multiculturalism, the idea that all cultures are equal, and that comes from tying culture to race. And you don't want to say that all races aren't equal, because you don't want to be a racist. But if race and culture are so interchanged, are interchanged or equivocated on, then you also can't say that any culture is better than the other. And so multiculturalism, which many Christians have bought into, results in the choice between either being a racist or being a cultural relativist. You either have to say all cultures are equal, and therefore there's no cultural values that are better or worse than any others, or you have to be a racist and say, no, this culture is better than other cultures, and therefore this race is better than other races, right? So the key is to disconnect the concept of race from the concept of culture, and point out that culture pertains primarily to ideas and values, not to skin color. And there might be common links between the two, but they aren't necessary links. So that's one thing that can help us to avoid that. And then just to get to the deeper philosophical issue that you were getting to, Jordan, only individuals can think, and therefore only individuals can judge what is true or false, and only individuals can act or have character, and therefore only individuals can be moral or be moral agents. The collective is only moral insofar as the individuals who make up the collective are moral, or immoral, right? There is no such thing as the collective apart from the individuals. What would that be? It's nothing. It doesn't exist. And once you realize that, then you start to realize why individualism is so fundamental to thinking about our humanity. Humans are fundamentally individuals, and only secondarily can we be involved in groups or collectives or corporate identities, so to speak. But those corporate identities are derivative of the individual identities, which all agree with each other in a given respect to form that corporation, whatever it may be. Now, to move on to the issue of works, I do think that there might be, so the social justice devil's advocate in me would say, it's true that forgiveness ought to work itself out in works. Just like regeneration is supposed to be accompanied by works. We are to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. And if we don't evidence some works of our salvation, of our regeneration in Christ, then that gives other people reason to doubt whether or not we actually are saved. And then, the analogy might be, if we don't work out our forgiveness, then it might give people on the outside a reason to doubt whether or not we actually have forgiven those people, or actually want to be forgiven of the crime, of whatever the case may be. So they might have a decent point in saying, hey, if you're really sorry, you should do X, Y, Z. But I think our point needs to be, I don't need to be sorry to begin with because I didn't do it. So the fundamental is, don't accept an unearned guilt. And then you don't have to worry about working it out because there's nothing to work out. If you deserve the guilt, then you should apologize for it, and you should do what you can to work out that apology. Does that make sense?
Yes, I totally agree. And I wanted to make one last comment on the collectivist identity. I think it should be interesting to note, especially like if there's any SJWs listening to this, it should be interesting to note that the Richard Spencer alt-right types claim the exact same thing, that race is the primary form of identity for all humans, and that race is the only identity that you can really operate on in the world. Mm-hmm. And the individualist answer to that is exactly what Jacob just says, that no, race would be very low identity. I mean, you could have, there are certain genetic traits or whatnot, height or something like that. But honestly, the primary tool of cognition that we have to determine or to understand reality and to process choices and actions is our mind. It is an individual mind. We don't have a collective mind. We don't have a collective stomach to digest food. And so we have to digest those thoughts individually and use our mind to think. The SJW both and the alt-right are both attacking reason itself when they claim that the primary identity comes from race or skin color or collective group.
Yeah, it's a very subhuman, animalistic view of humanity that Christians ought to repudiate in either direction. Absolutely.
Let's go to Matthew. You
Matthew.
there?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So, man, that was a good exchange right there. I like that. But I guess what was on my mind throughout this is that social justice warriorism kind of shows itself to be anti-reason, in that a lot of the times they're not just not persuaded by arguments, but it seems that they have a willingness to err on the side of the marginalized or the poor, meaning that they don't see the urgency in being right on this issue. Like, they don't see the need to be correct, to be on the correct side. Just if they're not sure about something, they're going to err on the side of the poor. And I've seen that come out in a couple of ways. Like, I've had conversations with people where you present facts and eventually it gets to the point to where they just don't want to engage anymore on the basis of whether something is true or not, but rather whether you're loving or something, something along those lines. And I was just kind of wondering, just from a practical standpoint, how do you deal with that? Have you seen any success with presenting certain arguments, or is it just so far from reason? The social justice warrior arguments, are they just so far from reason that it's kind of a bust, and we just have to do what we can to bolster our own side?
I don't think it's a bust, but let me bolster our own side for a second, because I'm glad you brought that up. It reminds me of a really important point that I want to talk about. So let me make my point, and then if I don't answer the last part of your question as far as strategy, remind me of it, and we'll address that. So
okay, cool.
I love the way that you framed and pointed out that they don't care so much about getting it right, meaning they don't care about the truth so much as they care about wanting to err on the side of caring for the poor or the oppressed or the needy or whatever the case is.
Yeah, exactly.
And the way I would re-summarize that is they don't care about reality or justice or truth or the objective glory of God. They care about altruism. And this is the evil of altruism. When caring for those with needs or otherism or self-sacrifice in general, however you want to describe altruism, and those are all good descriptions of altruism, whenever that becomes the end-all and be-all of virtue, everything else, including truth, justice, and the glory of God, must bow the knee to it. And that's one of the reasons I rail so vehemently against it. Now, what's the alternative? The alternative is to care about getting things right. Now, how am I going to do that? I've got to care about me, about my own soul getting something right. I have to care about my own mind matching up to the reality of the situation, which means I've got to be selfish in some sense. I've got to care about the health of my soul matching the truth of reality and responding to the truth of reality regardless of the needs of others. So the only way to really combat that in a consistent, principled way, which is what we've been talking about, is to have some sort of view of rational self-interest, where you see that, no, the health of my soul matters more than anything else, more than anyone else's needs. Let God be true, and let my soul recognize what is true, what is God's truth, though everyone in need perishes. Because as Jesus says, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul. You could substitute that. What does it profit a man to help all the needy in the world and lose his own soul? If you lose your own soul in order to cater to the poor, you're going to hell eventually if you're consistent with that, and you're going to drag all those other poor people to hell along with you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's so evil and so corrupt, and it makes me very angry that Christians are functionally buying into this nonsense. And this is a good demonstration as to why we need rational self-interest. And rational is important there. It needs to be holy and godly and informed by all of reality, including all of Scripture. But we need to have a care for our own souls, which is the only way we can actually consistently care about getting things right, like getting the truth right, getting justice right, getting the glory of God right. And that's, in the end, the only way to combat all this nonsense about caring for the poor, eclipsing true justice and the truth of the situation.
All right, guys, this has been a fantastic discussion. Looking forward to watching the replay. And I want to wrap up by inviting Jacob. Could you summarize your answer to the question, Christians, what do we need to know in order to persuade people that the SJWs are mistaken? What is it that we're missing?
Oh, okay. Number one, working from what we just said. Number one, you've got to focus on your own relationship to God above all. It doesn't matter how many poor people you help, or how many supposedly oppressed people you help, or you think you're helping. If you don't get the difference between true oppression and true justice, etc., versus false oppression and false justice, if you don't get that right, if you don't get right the difference between true goodness and true evil, and you end up calling what is not oppression oppression, and calling what is not evil good, or sorry, calling what is not evil evil, and calling what is not good good, if you get those things wrong, you are going to lose your soul and the souls of all those that you are ministering to or attempting to minister to. You're going to make a shipwreck of your faith and the faith of everybody else. So the most important thing is to focus on getting the truth right in your own mind, to make judgments accurately. And you got to figure out how to do that. You've got to find objective criteria to do that. That's what epistemology helps you with. So that's number one, is focus on what is true. And then from there, judge rightly, ask questions, rely on, or take the responsibility to make your own independent judgment of those things. Don't kowtow to emotional manipulation, which is sort of the modus operandi of a lot of these social justice warriors. Don't give in to accepting a false guilt that you don't deserve. Just because you know that you're guilty before God doesn't mean that you're guilty of every sin that every person wants to convict you of. And if you accept a false guilt for whatever reason, whether it's a sense of false humility or whatever the case is, you are distorting God's truth. And so you need to learn to think of it not as standing up for yourself, but more importantly, as standing up for the truth, for standing up for God's truth, which means standing up for His glory. And if someone wants to call you selfish or bigoted or participating in white privilege or whatever the case may be, you need to have an attitude of, I don't care. I care more about God's glory than I care about any other opinion of man. So that's sort of the second is get rid of your fear of man, whether it's one person or the entire church or the entire world making false accusations against you. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't shake your faith at all, so long as you know that you've got the truth right. See, and that's really what that boils down to. You've got to learn to stand on your own before God and know that you are standing on the truth, no matter what anybody else wants to say. And then ask questions and be open to being corrected. If you're wrong, you want to be proven that you're wrong. But then you've got to be proven. You got to make sure that it's actually right. You've got to be discerning, and then go from there. And there's lots of application questions from there. But I think that's That's the center. That's where you've got to start from. At any other starting point, you're going to go off track really quick. You're going to fall victim to their false accusations and their manipulations, and you're ultimately going to be inconsistent and give them a foothold.
When you're seeking the truth, go to the principle of the matter. Find out what the principle is that other people are advocating and understand it. Understand why it's wrong if it's wrong, and then understand why your principle is correct. Well, guys, thank you for joining on this video. And if you'd like to become a supporter of our podcast and our YouTube channel and the whole thing, go to christianintellectual.com/subscribe to get on our email list, and /Patreon if you want to join in one of these discussions just like this in the future. We would love to have you. Thanks, guys, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys.